covenants instead of refugee conventions, which means that any refugee or asylum seeker in the future will enjoy exactly the same rights as a Taiwanese national. The other issue I'd like to bring to your attention is that even though we don't have refugee law and we don't have that many asylum seekers in Taiwan, we are taking care of refugees because of Australia. I think a few months ago, Australia transferred 2 refugees based in Nauru, originally from Iran to Taiwan for medical treatment. And so it's some kind of like outsourcing. So
from within mainland Australia or one
from Nauru, but they are the refugee recognized or determined by Australia, and they put them in Nauru. And because Nauru has the official relations with Taiwan, they transfer those 2 refugees to Taiwan for some medical treatment. And after several weeks, according to the Guardian from UK, they reported that the Australian security department or police department sent a troop to take them back to Australia. And we tried to file an official letter to our immigration bureau requesting for further information. They declined because they said there's a secret agreement among Australia, Nauru, and Taiwan in terms of this. And it seems that there may be more cases when it comes to medical treatment of refugees based in Australia in the future. Yes.
So that's really an example of regional collaboration in a possibly very negative sense, in terms of things not being handled in a transparent way, affecting the social rights of the people involved and possibly not really considering those rights really, but considering, as you mentioned, the political dimensions more than anything else. I haven't heard of that actually, so thank you for bringing that up. And it is interesting to see what countries can do when they collaborate, and hopefully if that is channeled into a more positive frame of mind, then perhaps something good could come out of it as well. So thank you for that. What I'm also interested to hear is if anyone has any experience within their jurisdiction of, say, using Article 14 or using any kind of international conventions to push for the social rights, either for refugees or including within the refugee group, obviously survivors of torture as well. So does anyone have anything to say, any experience or, yeah?
I just wanted to give some picture about the refugees situation in Thailand and also on the use of the Article 14 in the different contexts in domestic torture survivors. Okay, we have the refugee situation like in along the border with the camps from Myanmar, it's still there. Maybe you forgot that we still have close to 100,000 refugees along Thailand border, and the situation in Myanmar is not getting better, so fighting is still going on. A lot of newcomers also come from different ethnic groups. And we also now have a situation of the trafficking, not only like corruption and being a lot to do with the loans, very harsh condition to the women. They were kept in the cage and they were selling like items, so it has been difficult. We do have a lot of older refugees from all over the world in Thailand, so like tourists we have been. But the situation is not very good for urban refugees because they are not being accepted, and of course the housing has been difficult. So the only way they can survive and fulfill all those rights is depends on the NGOs working on helping the refugees. There are a number of them, but never enough. So the situation of particularly that I involved with is just a family of the Pakistanis from Christian community there. So with 5 young kids, they were taken to be returned to detention center where the situation was so Hajj recorded, and 2 months ago we have reported 2 elderly men from Asian region in the detention. So this situation is haunting them not to return, but it's very exceptional where the family would be arrested and go back to detention center and get the bail out. If not, you can be detained indefinite because no country or the third country would accept you, even though you have a UNHCR refugee recognitions, but Thai police is not accepting this recognition. So to be away from detention center and to have a small apartment, to have just enough food to feed your kids, it's already difficult. So later education, this young boy speaking Thai perfect because he has been there for a long time, but he did not have English education. He only studied because he wanted to have the family communicate with the society. So I'm not sure all the other kids would have to be in Thailand until they grow up. So medical treatment also depends on the NGOs, and they have been helping. Like the NGOs can send staff to the apartment, but I also heard that the government or the UP government is going after the helper. Like I can be what you call kept and intimidated of providing assistance to refugees. They would check your primary or something like that. And another situation of the survival of the conflict in the deep south, of that is still okay with them, right to housing, right to education, but the thing is right to work, they cannot go back to the sort of work that they've been before, so they will not be accepted after they've been arrested and detained in the military camp. Right to medical treatment is the most difficult thing for survival of torture because you're not comfortable to go to the state facility for health care. We have quite good universal health care. Everyone don't need to go to pay anything. You just have the ID card and you can enter into the public hospital. You can get treatment. But the treatment is not recognizing you as a torture victims. They don't treat you as a torture victim. Documentation is very difficult. Doctor did not want to go to court. Doctor did not want to interview longer than how are you, and then you keep some description and then you get medicine. So psychological problem and issues. We have actually assistance from Malaysian psychiatrist friends who are providing services, but not officially, but because they speak the same dialect, so we got some help from them. But for the local one who's speaking Thai, treating Malayan Muslim in different way, it's still very limited. Okay? And we use the CAT commissions to highlight the problems of the way to medical treatment of the survival of victims of torture. But we have military crew, so the follow-up of the recommendation we need for so we are stuck with the help from professionals in Thailand to assist the torture victims.
Okay, I think Pia had something to comment.
I just have a question to ask you. So Thailand has been one of the very few countries where you've actually signed up to the individual complaints mechanism of the Convention of the Rights of the Child. So you can actually bring a complaint on behalf of a child to the committee. So when I was in the UK, we were actually following it very closely because we don't have that complaints mechanism. And we were interested to see whether it would be used to actually try and advocate about Article 14 specifically in relation to many of these rights. So I'm just curious to see, has that been done? Because I know that was like 4 years ago. So
not yet. You're welcome to work with us. We need live together. We need psychological support. We have Bangkok for you. You come and work with us.
I jump in? So South Korea, you actually have the convention, refugee convention, so you're one of the unique countries. So I'd be really curious to know what's the situation in South Korea?
South Korea ratified the Refugee Convention, and also we have the Refugee Act, but the problem is how to implement it in society. And also the refugee problems in South Korea is pretty new to us. Yes, we do have some refugees from North Korea, but it has kind of different political and historical context. So when it comes to refugees from outside of Korean territory, first, the refugee status determination, I think the rate you can get the status of refugee is only 2%. And after you get the refugee status, you can have 6 months support money, but it's very small. It's $250 per person. Right to housing, you have the shelter, but if you get out of the shelter, you have to get out of the shelter after 6 months, and afterwards you have to pay the rent, and if you cannot afford it, and if you don't have NGO who supports you, you just have to find a way by yourself if you're a refugee. And also right to work. You can get working permit, and you have a consultant with the institution about the kind of job that you can work for. But in Korean culture, we are not really used to have international workers, so it's kind of similar to the situation in Thailand. You cannot go back to the working area that you used to work in your original country. And about the right to education. Education situation is a little bit better because you can get the support when your kid is under 3 to 5 years old. And you can have free education from elementary school to high school. But the problem is you have to find a school that's going to accept your kids. If the school denies it, you have to find the school, even if it's really far from your house. Right to medical treatment. You can get medical insurance support for the 6 months after you get the refugee status, but afterwards you kind of have to pay for yourself. And if you don't have a job that's going to support you with the medical insurance, you can't really afford it. So a lot of the refugees, they deny the medical insurance because it's too expensive to afford it.
All right, thank you very much. So once again, the situation of implementation, access, rather than rights on paper. And what the situation in Thailand is interesting as well, with really NGOs and civil societies trying to plug the gap, but in fact, the state is putting barriers in the way and targeting people who are actually trying to fill the gaps. So thank you everyone for sharing how it is in Redress. We do have to wrap this up now and move on to our next session, but I think it's good to do this mapping and then use this, and we can turn to this later this afternoon to have a think in terms of torture rehabilitation. How do we use what we have in terms of the regional and international conventions and framework in order to push for these rights and expand these rights within the region collaboratively. So that is something that we wish to turn back to. But now we were meant to have a breakout, but Martin Rogers is unfortunately very unwell today, so he will not be coming in. So Tracy will have the floor and will remain in this room. Tracy has come all the way from Queensland and has an extensive career working on, with mental health and other rehabilitation outcomes for torture survivors in Australia. So we're very fortunate to have her here.
Is it connected to here? Yeah. You're welcome, and then you can interrupt. No, it's good. Is this on? Is this on? No. Oh, it has a little diffy too. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Tracy Worrell. I'm the Chief Executive of an organisation called QPAST, which full name is up there, Queensland Program of Assistance to Survivors of Torture and Trauma. I am going to take you a little bit about what our role is and what we do. And one of the things that Australia is very lucky around, which probably doesn't necessarily or isn't replicated throughout most of the countries in the region, is we actually have access to a lot of data. So we get access for everybody to data of everybody who's in detention, everyone who's an asylum seeker, what the processing rates are, who's where. So I was going to share some of that data with people as well. I guess so I wanted to start by addressing the elephant in the room for Australia. And that's that Australia has gone from a country which really did have fantastic reputation internationally around its refugee and asylum seeker program to, in the last 8 years or so, being known for its processing around Nauru and Manus, which is awful and terrible, and Gary is going to talk about that later. So I'm not going to talk much about that, except to say that it is a bit of a blight on us and something that depresses us, people who work in the sector, immensely. However, I would like to talk about some of the things that we actually do really well. And one of the things I say to the staff in our agency is we get very immersed in the minutiae of what we do badly, but sometimes we actually need to think about what we do well. And we work with thousands and thousands of torture survivors, and most of them fly. And we need to remember that in fact they're survivors, they're resilient, and they can have wonderful outcomes, provided we put in place the right supports. So I guess I wanted to just talk very briefly to acknowledge that, I suppose, that we have both, I think, probably the best and the worst in our practice. So I just want to take people through a few of our statistics. So Australia, as most people may know, has mostly had a reputation as a resettlement country. So in fact, we take the third largest number of people for permanent resettlement in the world. That's still not very many, but it is quite a lot internationally. And so they're people who've actually been settled via UNHCR. They come straight out of the UNHCR program in camps across the world. And since 2012-2013, so in the last 5 years, we've actually settled just over 70,000 people via that program. And that program is divided into 3 areas of settlement, mainly. So about just under 50% are straight refugee status, about just under, well, it's probably 40%, and then about another 40% are people who are sponsored, so they've already got a member of their family living in Australia, they're refugee status, and then about 20% are what we call women at risk visas. So yesterday we were talking about gender violence, so that we have a separate visa for women who are considered at risk or have experienced violence, so they come. Every year Australia settles 18,750. So they're settled across Australia, huge range of locations across Australia, and I can talk about that later if people want. UNHCR makes the determination, so Australia doesn't make the refugee determination for that group of people. Once they arrive in Australia, they're provided with between 12 months and 5 years settlement support, and that's depending on need and circumstances. So if someone arrives and essentially fairly happy to get on with their lives, and they may not access that level of support. But if someone comes from very complex situations, they've got high levels of trauma, high levels of torture, they might get 5 years worth of settlement support.
and that's specialised support. They also have access to mainstream services and mainstream health, mainstream housing support, etc., youth services, and a range of community services. All have access to what we call the fast services, and they access our services for many years after arrival. So there's no time length on how long someone can access or when they choose to access our services. About 30% of people arriving in Australia will access a fast service, so that's, and I'll explain what that is, but they can access our services up to 30 or 40 years after arrival. So someone who might have come out for many years, gone on with life, and then they re-triggered, can still access our services. In terms of asylum within Australia, so last year, 18,000, so just under 20,000 people sought asylum in Australia after arriving by plane. So most of those come from Asian countries, so China, Malaysia, India, Vietnam, etc. There's currently a grant rate of about 9.2% for those arrivals. And most of those come with a valid visa, a student visa or other visas, and then claim asylum in Australia. There are still approximately 18,000 people who arrive by boat and are still being processed. So they are people who arrived by boat prior to 2012, and there's a 75% grant rate for that group. There's still just over, and there's about 12,000, 13,000 people who arrived in that cohort and sought asylum and have been granted. So they've got temporary protection visas. People who arrived after boat, after 2012, were sent to offshore processing centres, and that's the Mona situation. So FAST agencies, FAST stands for the Forum of Australian Services for Survivors of Torture and Trauma. We're refugee recovery, trauma recovery services. We work with people from refugee background and asylum seekers who've experienced torture or trauma prior to arrival in Australia. There's one of us in every state and territory in Australia, so I manage the Queensland service. Gary at the back actually works with the South Australian service. So together we provide services to about 18,000 survivors every year. Most of those people have poor mental health. Now that results from torture and also high levels of complex trauma, but there are also other related causes, of course. Some people just may just have poor mental health, as a percentage of the population does. But often long-term detention or long-term displacement in harsh conditions can lead to poor mental health. As a set of services, we don't require a diagnosis, and we work with people regardless of diagnosis. We don't even seek a diagnosis. We don't believe it's in the best interests of our clients. And referrals come from a huge range of multiple sources. So people can refer, anyone can refer to us, actually. A lot of referrals come from settlement services, lawyers, GPs, probably one of our highest level education departments, but we also take self-referral. So probably up to 30% of our referrals come from the community or from a self-referral. And as part of our recovery framework, so we work within a very strong recovery framework, we very strongly focus on the abnormality of the experiences. So that is that it's the experiences that are driving what's happening to people rather than on the symptoms that they're currently experiencing. So we don't necessarily seek to put people within a mental health framework or a mental health label, but we try to normalise that within. If we had experienced what they've experienced, then we would all probably have poor mental health. We provide long-term therapeutic recovery services, and they can be quite clinical depending on individual need and individual. We work with children, young people, families, and individual adults, but we also work at the family and the community level. And one of the things we do, and if anyone was specifically interested, we would be happy to share you some of this, but we collect extensive data as a national network on demographics, so how many children we work with, how many adults we work with, how long we work with people for on average. We also keep extensive symptomology data, so what sort of symptoms we're working with and what people are presenting with. And we also have just commenced collecting experience, so that's torture and trauma experiences as a national data set. So we've always collected that as part of our assessments, but we're actually collecting that as part of our national database.
It's of course a de-identified database, so it's actually combined across all of the people we work with. And we can tell a story, if you like. We can tell stories through that. So we will work with people. Some people will access a few sessions. Some people might access our services for many years. I can tell you that in our service, 48% of our clients are under 25. Probably 54 are women. So we can give people a whole range of data. In terms of QPAST, we're all NGOs, by the way. We're all not-for-profit NGOs. We're all established by refugee community members themselves. QPAST was established in 1995. Some of the others are a little bit older. And we were deliberately established by refugee communities to provide a community-based response rather than a medical response to survivors of torture. Every service provides a state-wide service, so we have to work across our states. In the case of Queensland, I don't know how many people are familiar with Australia, but Queensland is a very large state, so it's about 2,000 kilometres from one end to the other. So we have to provide, and we do provide services in 14 locations across our state. That's all the specific information I'm really going to give you on QPAST, but you're welcome to look up our website, and we keep data on our website, and I can provide data if people are interested. So I guess the most important thing from our perspective is our connection to refugee communities. When QPAST was established, people were predominantly coming into Australia from South and Latin America, but also places like Vietnam and former Yugoslavia, and they really drove the establishment of these services. And what they wanted is not to be put into a medical, individually pathologised box. They wanted to be treated within the context of their experiences. So, and I guess last year, might be interesting, we work with people from 70 different nationalities, and we always use interpreters just for interest. So we provide recovery services at the individual, family and community level. It's very important that we hear the voices of the communities we work with in order to develop trust and relationships. We can't work with people to improve their mental health if we don't develop a trust and a relationship with both them and the communities that they come from. For us, in terms of an assessment, if people are here from a mental health background, we would never do an assessment or an interview in a single session. So we would take 6 sessions, sometimes longer, before we can complete an assessment. And some people won't disclose what's happened to them for years. So they might go along, they might be seeking to access services, they might have the same counsellor, and then in 5 years' time might suddenly disclose what's happened to them. One of the other challenges we have is they will disclose things to us that they won't disclose to other people, to health systems, and most importantly will often not want their legal advisors to know. And that puts us in a real dilemma. So a classic example is a male who suffered sexual assault. So as part of their experiences, they may not have told their family, they may not have told anyone. It would aid their asylum seeker process, but they still won't disclose it because of the shame around that. And so we really have to work with them. That's our decision. I would like to also point out that for us, working with people in asylum seeker process, it's much harder to provide recovery services, and our experience would be you almost can't. You can maintain, if you're lucky, someone's mental health, but if they don't have long-term safety, it's very hard to recover. So safety is almost a necessary component for long-term mental health recovery. So that's a list of some of the services that we provide. They're all provided within a holistic framework. Some people will use one, and that's all they'll ever use. So we may have a young person who comes to Homework Club, which is a very important early intervention strategy for us, and what we call a soft entry strategy. They might come along to Homework Club, then they might start disclosing to someone in Homework Club. But they may also just go on and do wonderful and have a wonderful life, but that's all they needed. Other people will use intensive services for many years, and they may access across all of those. One of the other things that we do a lot of is capacity building of mainstream services, and we would work a lot with other health, legal and settlement services.
So just to give you an idea, in 16-17 we worked with just under 6,000 survivors of torture and trauma in Queensland from 70 different countries of origin. 2,000 individuals received one-on-one support, so counselling or other support, and we ran 346 group sessions for nearly 4,000 participants. We provided service training to service providers for 1,600 providers, and one of the things we do a lot of is we work with schools. So if we can ensure that schools have an appropriate environment for young people from refugee backgrounds, then in fact that's often critical to their ongoing well-being, particularly given that trauma is often intergenerational. Queensland has 70 staff, just to sort of give you a picture of that. So I guess I did want to talk about some of the frameworks that we use, and I am conscious of the time. So I guess one of our key recovery frameworks is that we focus on community. Now the reason that we do that within the Australian context is because we work with communities who have been totally disrupted as a whole community. So within the mainstream Australian community, Australia hasn't suffered a civil war. It hasn't had a lot of what I'd call community-wide trauma, if you like. So people who suffer trauma in Australia do so within an individual perspective, and they may seek an individual response to that trauma. But when we're talking about refugee communities, they're communities who've actually, everyone in the community has experienced some level of trauma. The whole communities have, and that's impacted on their community capacity, their capacity to support other members of their community. So we do a lot of work at that broader level to empower communities in order to support other members of that community. Now I guess one of the riders I put on that when you're working with torture survivors is for a lot of torture survivors, of course torture has occurred within their home community, so they don't always trust their home community. So that's up to individuals to determine. Some never want to have any contact with their own community because they don't trust them, they don't have a relationship with them because that's where their torture has occurred. But for most people, they want to be able to connect to their community and to the wider community. We don't have capacity, and I would suggest very few countries would have capacity to work with everybody on an individual basis. So we can address recovery at a multiple level by increasing community resilience and enabling communities to support each other. And we can actually also address the wider context for which torture has occurred. So we do a lot of work at community level, and I guess this was talked about yesterday by Jen. We do a lot of focus on healing rather than on mental health. So we don't really talk about mental health. We talk a lot about healing and we talk a lot about recovery. The reason we do that is because most of the people we work with don't come from a Western concept and relate to Western individual concepts around therapeutic frameworks and around mental health. Most people we work with very high levels of stigma. They're not going to come and say, hey, I think I've got a mental health problem. For some people we work with, it's not even within a framework at all. They'll say they've been cursed or there might have been some witchcraft. Other people will just go, I know someone's not coping, but they're never going to talk about mental health. So that's why we don't have that conversation either. So we talk very much about healing, and that's why we don't seek a diagnosis. And we very much stay away from a framework where the professional is the expert and talk very much about an individual being an expert in their own healing process. And we don't talk about that individual pathology. We spend a lot of time trying to keep people out of the mental health system, actually. When working with survivors, we find for a lot of them the diagnosis is completely irrelevant. They do want to address factors such as safety, stability, restoration and belief systems, and a whole lot of redress systems in order to move into healing. Yesterday there was some conversation about the use, I suppose, of the broader welfare systems and the role in providing safety and healing. We use what we call a counsellor advocate model. It's an interdisciplinary model. We don't employ people because of particular modalities. We use a range of modalities and a range of healing processes. Everybody we employ does have a qualified either psychologists or social workers or counsellors. But it's an interdisciplinary model. We call them all counsellor advocates. They're not advocates in a legal process. They're advocates because we recognise that often we need to address the broader impacts before we can address a healing impact. So if someone isn't in safe housing, then in fact the counsellor needs to help them address the issue of housing before we can actually move on to healing, because we can't talk about healing if in fact they're not in a place of safety. So that's why we use what we call a counsellor advocate model. For a lot of our clients, there are issues such as family reunion, and that requires legal support, so then we'll link them with a legal advocate, for example. I have a quote up there that we use, which is actually from the Dalai Lama in a conversation between Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama, and we actually think it's a rather nice one, that curing involves the resolution of illness, but it's not always possible. Healing, he said, was coming to wholeness, whether or not the illness was curable. So for many of us, we know we're not going to be able to cure what's occurred to the people we work with, but hopefully we can help them come to a wholeness. So in summary, and I've got a whole lot of some case examples of people who'd like to talk about them, but I also want to, I guess, have a conversation with people. But we think there's a real importance of wraparound and soft entry programs. We don't very often have people who knock on our door. We do sometimes, but we don't very often have people who knock on our door and say, hey, I want some counselling. Well, so what we do is provide a whole lot of group work and soft entry programs that enable people to build relationship and trust. So Homework Club, for example, very simple solution, but what it does is bring a whole lot of kids in. They need help with their homework. Their parents are often not able, they don't know enough about the Australian education system. They may not have had access to education themselves. They may have so much trauma that they're actually not able to engage with the education system. So the kids come in. Everybody who comes to Australia, they want their kids to be doctors, they want their kids to be lawyers or engineers. That's not always going to be possible when someone might have spent, their first 18 years in a refugee camp and they've had 2 years of schooling. So that also leads to a very high risk around suicidality because the parents want them to do well, but in fact in reality they're not going to perhaps achieve that level that their parents want them to achieve. So we run homework clubs, very soft entry, very simple approach, but the kids come. Some kids, actually that's all they need. And in fact we had a young man from Rohingya background who came and accessed our homework club, and then I was at a community leaders dinner. We run community leaders dinner so that leaders can connect with each other and share ways of supporting their communities. And I didn't actually know him, and he asked if he could talk, and I said, yep, sure. Not quite knowing what he was going to say. But he actually talked about he'd come to Australia, had 2 years of schooling left within the Australian system. He'd gone to a school, had no English. And the school wasn't supporting him very much with his English, but he knew the word homework because the teacher told him that every day. And so he happened to come to our office one day and saw that there was the word homework. So he asked if he could join in our homework club. And he did, and the homework club tutors linked him with an English tutor. He was clearly very bright. In 2 years, with a language that wasn't English, he got enough of a university entrance score to study pharmacy, and he was then in second year pharmacy. And he said that QPAR saved his soul. And it did it just by providing a homework club. It's a very simple solution, and for me, the alternative is he didn't get support, and he would have probably ended up needing long-term support. He didn't, and he was back volunteering in homework club. He only needed a simple solution. So we concentrated a lot on the people who need really complex long-term therapeutic work. That's what occupies a lot of our thoughts and our brains in our organisation. So for example, someone was talking about the people of Nauru in Taiwan. We're currently receiving the children from Nauru into Brisbane who are going into shutdown mode. They're very unwell. That's what occupies most of our thought. But for a lot of the people we work with, they need simple solutions, and they're not expensive solutions, and they fly. So, and I think it's really important that if you're looking at setting up rehabilitation services, that we actually talk about mental health in the context of normal reactions to abnormal experiences. And we need to understand the impact on the whole of life of trauma. So it's not just on individual mental health, but on the associated life context. So relationships, memory, capacity to learn, all of those things. Every individual is different, and we find very clearly that what works for one individual is not going to work for another individual. Within our Western more medical system, Australia loves to give people 12 sessions of CBT. I don't know if people from mental health, in the legal, but people in mental health know about that. Not really going to work with our clients. So, you know, some it might work with, but they don't access a lot of the mainstream programs. And communities need to be able to provide their own perspective on recovery, and all services need to be underpinned by client control. So control is probably the biggest issue for us in terms of client restoration of safety. If people have control, then in fact they're on the road to safety. So I just wanted to talk really quickly about some studies that we do jointly, particularly with the legal, because I know a lot of people from a legal process here. So that's called the Indrapilli Clinic. That's a very Aboriginal word in Australia. It's a service that provides pro bono support for people filling in applications for asylum, and also provides legal advice when they're having their applications either rejected or confirmed. So the lawyers and other people providing there, from students, law students who are providing support into that clinic, find themselves in the position of having to give people pretty harsh news. And lawyers are very often not trained or comfortable in doing that, and people will often disclose suicidation at that point. So we provide counselling support into that clinic, not just to support people who come and have bad news and and often are suicidal if the news is negative, but actually to support the lawyers, because the lawyers find that very difficult. We provide vicarious trauma and self-care for mainstream agencies and for lawyers, amongst other people. We do joint presentations for people seeking asylum in groups and what their options are. And we take part in what's called the Refugee Health Partnership. So that's a more mainstream health response. So in Australia, people get their mainstream health through GPs, medical clinics, rather than coming to a clinic like ours, but GPs will refer to us. I was asked earlier to just briefly talk about suicidality, because that was talked about yesterday. We do an awful lot of work around suicidality. That's an everyday presentation for us in our work. But I'd like to say that most of the work that we work with around suicidality, the root causes are not mental health. So the presentation is, but the solutions are not. So the causes are things like survivor guilt, visa outcomes, family separation. The solutions are frequently not actually in the mental health system, unfortunately. The mental health system can keep them safe, but the solutions to what people are feeling are actually in other areas of work. And that's why we do a lot of advocacy and work with, for example, lawyers. Because unless we can solve their problems, they're going to remain suicidal. But it's certainly one of our key areas. We have a lot of suicidality around people who are facing a return. So once someone has gone through an asylum seeker process and they are supposed to return, Australia will only provide a forced return to countries who will accept. At the moment in Australia, that's actually not where our primary asylum seeker caseload is from, except for Sri Lanka. So the forced returns to Sri Lanka, but not to the Middle East, for example. So those people are not forced returns, but maybe on a negative for many, many years. So I guess I just wanted to open it up to any discussion and whether anyone would like. Perhaps I should say one of the things that Australia does very well is fund our services. So we've been going extensively for a very long time. The Australian government, through the Department of Health, so not through immigration, but through the Department of Health and through its commitment under the Convention Against Torture, even though perhaps that's questionable at the moment, provides the recovery against torture services. We get about 26 million a year. So we're actually extensively funded through government as part of its response to that convention. And through the Commonwealth Department of what we call the Department of Health, not through immigration. So would anyone like to talk about their experiences in their country, or everyone's completely silent? I can talk about some examples of services, but I'd probably rather hear from what other people are doing, or whether there's anything you think we can do to support you. Yeah. Can you? Sorry, I can't.
If you didn't have that kind of funding model, such as in Hong Kong, where it seems that NGOs are not funded by the government to provide similar services, are there any lessons that perhaps we could learn as to how to provide community-based services on a small budget?
Yeah. I think there are a lot. I think even though it seems that, and we're quite well resourced, that's not our budget, that's the Australia-wide budget, we still have very long waiting lists because people access the services, but some of the services are quite inexpensive to provide and could be done on pro bono or volunteers or charitable donations. But I guess one of the learnings for us as a national network is we have very much had conversations with government around its commitment under the Convention Against Torture and around the economic and civic gains in providing recovery rather than the economic drain on having people who aren't able to recover, if you like. So we're very much concentrated around those conversations and actually separated ourselves as a set of services away from what is a very divisive argument about refugee and asylum seekers. What we've found in Australia, and I don't know about here, is that politicians in Australia are really buying into divisive politics around asylum seekers and refugees and determining who comes here. But I haven't found a single politician who is game enough to say they don't support the Convention Against Torture. And so if we focus on that end, then we've actually had a lot more gain, whereas the services that are very much focused around how you support, an asylum seeker have had much less gain. But very much around philanthropic support is a very good place to start. In Australia, we've had a lot of people who have been very successful and have come from refugee backgrounds. So, and are often willing to fund those sort of services. Does that make sense? But things like Homework Club, we run on an absolute pittance. We have someone who facilitates it and volunteer tutors. Sorry.
Can I ask on your budget again? In the UK, there's a theme of budgets being cut and public spending being squeezed. How stable is your budget, and has it in the last couple of years, has it been growing or has it been reducing, and is it a threat?
We're in fact incredibly lucky in that our budget has steadily increased in the last 20 years. We've just signed off on another 3 years. We're also not, for a lot of Western countries, have heavily gone down the tender line. Whoever is the best service, who provides the best tender. The federal government has been very committed to a specialist range of services and the expertise around that. So our budget has increased and is stable at this stage. Politicians are liable to change their mind, but within that context, it's stable. Yeah. But it's because we come out of health and we don't get involved in the border protection fight. Or we do, but not under a funding budget.
To people who have their claims rejected and being sent back, those people presumably mentally are in a different situation because they've lost any hope of security. Now, here in Hong Kong, a lot of people feel the percentage of acceptance is 1 under 1%. And there's a feeling of hopelessness that goes on as the case develops. Any observations on what one might do for these people who either have been rejected or are hopeless that they might be accepted?
It's really tough. We have quite a lot of, that's an area we don't get funded to provide. So once somebody has lost their whole raft of legal appeals, they become unfunded clients in the community for us, and but we continue to see them. I guess the two things around are around hope and control. So once hope is gone, it's very hard to provide recovery services. So we have to concentrate on very small levels of hope. So it's very hard to concentrate on much greater levels of hope. It's a daily hope. What can you do? You know, what can you do today? What can you do tomorrow? What sort of hope is there? Because we're really seeking maintenance of health, or at least seeking not to see it deteriorate rather than recovery. To be honest, you can't provide a recovery service to someone who is no longer got hope or security. And the other thing is ensuring that they have control over some part of their life. If you can maximise control, you can maximise some kind of safety. At the end of the day, sometimes for people, that's really hard. And I don't think any of us actually have an answer to that. Because it's very hard. I mean, that's what we're seeing with Nauru and Manus, of course, the loss of hope. Now, a lot of people on Nauru, and Gary will probably talk about this, have got a refugee determination, but have the complete hopelessness of where their future is what's driving their very poor mental health. And what we're seeing with the children is what they're now calling shutdown syndrome. So they're literally just shutting down.
Hey Tracy, thank you so much for the presentation. I just wanted to ask you, so here in Hong Kong, and from the little I've been able to see, I see that communities seem to be not very well connected. And in that context, I find it very difficult to know where to start. And I'm struggling with that, but I think that we need to do it. And I want to ask your advice, given that we have a very plural population here. I wanted to know what you think about where we could start developing them.
Yeah, and perhaps we can have a really big conversation, but I guess one of the things is Australia actually, the fast services, we know that comparatively across Australia we're well off. We're quite active members of the IRCT, and we're really happy to support other services with a range of things. So, for example, we have refugee health guides around how medical practitioners can work with people who've experienced torture, how to use interpreters, a whole range of stuff. We have booklets on how to work with schools. We're really happy to share those resources. We don't need to own them. And so we would be really happy to provide you with resources and a whole range of stuff around working in recovery-based services.
Can I just also add on to Miguel's question, because he was being diplomatic, and as those who know me know, I'm more direct. It's not a case of resources here, it's actually a case of communication between organisations about what they're doing in Hong Kong. So because, as Rob pointed out, we have extremely limited funding. So the government doesn't provide any funding to a service where the beneficiary would be an asylum seeker and in fact a recognised refugee, because technically they're an illegal entrant under our immigration rules. So because they don't fund anything, so that's all the local organisations, etc., or any organisation. Therefore, the Jockey Club, which is the largest donor,